Have you ever asked yourself a very simple yet extremely important question? If the United States is the country with the strongest military in the world, with annual military spending greater than the combined defense budgets of dozens of countries, then why has completely defeating a country like Iran become such a difficult problem? On paper, the answer seems almost obvious. The United States possesses a defense budget of more than $800 billion each year, a system of B-2 stealth bombers, nuclear aircraft carriers, military satellites, a network of bases spread across the globe, and a military technological apparatus that no other nation can match. Meanwhile, Iran spends only a few tens of billions of dollars on defense. Its economy has endured many years of sanctions, and its military technology is largely based on older designs or improvements derived from systems that have existed for several decades. If viewed in the usual way, this appears to be a contest whose outcome was decided even before it began. But the problem with modern warfare, and also an important lesson in strategic economics, is that absolute power is not the only determining factor. What truly determines the outcome is the cost required to achieve the final objective. In the economics of war, there is a very important concept: the cost of victory. A war is not evaluated simply by who destroys more targets, but by which side can sustain the war longer without causing the collapse of its own economic and political system. This is precisely where weaker nations often change the entire set of rules. They do not attempt to win in the way the stronger opponent expects. Instead, they design strategies that make the opponent's victory extremely expensive. Iran has been thinking about this for more than 2 decades, since the early 2000s, when its nuclear program began attracting the attention of the West. Strategic planners in Tehran were almost certain that one day they would have to face military attacks from the United States or Israel. And rather than trying to build a military force capable of confronting the world's #1 superpower directly, a task that is nearly impossible, they chose a completely different path, building a defense system and war strategy that prevents the opponent from achieving a rapid victory. If you look at the history of modern warfare, you will see that this is not a new strategy. Vietnam applied it in its war with the United States. Afghanistan has applied it for decades against different great powers. And in every case, the pattern is the same when a powerful country enters a war, believing it can end it quickly, but later realizes that the cost of sustaining the war continues to increase over time. The strategic balance begins to change. For the United States, the problem is not the ability to destroy Iran's military targets. With current technology, the United States can strike almost any ground target in Iran using stealth aircraft, cruise missiles, and precision-guided bombs. But the real question that economists and strategists are asking is not whether the United States can destroy those targets, but whether destroying them would actually produce the strategic outcome that the United States desires. Because in modern warfare, destroying infrastructure is only the first step. After that comes a chain of economic and political reactions that can last for many years. Oil prices can surge when conflict spreads across the Middle East, a region that controls a large portion of the global energy supply. Financial markets can become extremely volatile as investors begin to worry about geopolitical risks. Governments may have to spend hundreds of billions of dollars more on the military and security. While public budgets are already under pressure from inflation, public debt, and social spending. And most importantly, domestic political support, the decisive factor for any long-term war, begins to decline. As the cost of war becomes clearer to the public, this is exactly why many experts in strategic economics often say that in the 21st century, war is no longer only a confrontation between armies. It is a confrontation between economic systems and the endurance of nations. Iran understands this very well. They know that they cannot defeat the United States in a traditional battle, but they also know that if they can turn the war into a prolonged, complex, and costly conflict, then even the most powerful superpower in the world will have to face its own limits. And when you begin to look at this war from an economic perspective, rather than only from a military perspective, you will realize something extremely important. The question is no longer who has the stronger army. The real question is who can endure the war longer without causing the collapse of their own system. From this perspective, the entire story of the conflict between the United States and Iran begins to appear far more complex than what we usually hear in daily news reports. And that is only the first layer of the problem. Because when we go deeper into the way Iran designed its entire defense system and nuclear program, you will see that they prepared for a scenario that many people in the West once believed was impossible. A war in which even the most powerful weapons in the world cannot destroy the most important targets. Part 1. The War Underground when Geology defeats military technology. If in the previous section we talked about the cost of war, this section focuses on a factor that few people think about, but that determines the entire strategic balance geology. In modern warfare, military technology can be extremely advanced, but it still has to obey the basic physical limits of the Earth. And Iran has used those limits to build a defense system that even the most powerful weapons in the world struggle to destroy. Since the early 2000s, when Iran's nuclear program began to become the center of international negotiations, the country's engineers and strategic planners made a decisive decision if they were attacked one day. The most important nuclear facilities had to be able to survive airstrikes. That meant these facilities could not be built on the surface, like ordinary industrial plants. They had to be placed somewhere that bombs would have difficulty reaching. As a result, many of Iran's key nuclear facilities were built deep inside mountains, beneath multiple layers of reinforced concrete and natural hard rock. One well-known example is the Fordo Uranium Enrichment Facility. This facility lies approximately 80 to 90 meters beneath a mountain. That number is not random. Iranian engineers carefully studied the penetration capability of bunker-buster bombs possessed by the United States. They then constructed the infrastructure deeper than the penetration limit of those weapons. This created a very unusual situation. Even if stealth aircraft could fly through air defense systems and drop bombs with extremely high precision, the most important target might still not be completely destroyed. To deal with facilities like these, the United States developed a special weapon called the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, one of the most powerful bunker buster bombs ever built. This is a bomb weighing many tons, designed to penetrate deep into the ground before detonating. But even this technology has physical limits. Each type of bomb can only penetrate to a certain depth, depending on the density of the material and the geological structure. When the target is located inside layers of hard rock and reinforced by multiple layers of concrete, the ability to destroy it completely becomes extremely difficult. This leads to a paradox in high-tech warfare. A country can invest tens of billions of dollars to develop advanced weapons, deploy stealth aircraft worth billions of dollars per squadron, and carry out complex airstrike operations lasting dozens of hours. Yet the final result may only be delaying the opponent's nuclear program for a short period of time, because the most important facilities remain deep beneath the mountain, where the power of bombs begins to encounter the natural limits of the Earth. But the problem goes even deeper than that. Even if a nuclear facility is completely destroyed, that does not mean the nuclear program will disappear. The reason is very simple. Weapons can destroy machines, but they cannot destroy knowledge. The engineers, scientists, and research systems that have existed for many years are still there. In the economics of technology, this is called knowledge capital, an intangible asset, but an extremely important one. Once a country has reached a certain level of scientific development, rebuilding infrastructure becomes only a matter of time and resources. That is why many strategic experts often say that a country's nuclear program does not exist only inside factories or centrifuges, but within the entire scientific and industrial ecosystem of that nation. And this ecosystem cannot be destroyed by a few airstrikes, no matter how precise they are. From the perspective of strategic economics, this creates an extremely difficult problem for military powers. Each attack campaign may cost billions of dollars, but the strategic benefits gained are very limited and temporary. Meanwhile, the country being attacked only needs to repair tunnels, replace equipment, and continue its program. This becomes a kind of cost race, in which the attacking side must continuously spend more money to achieve increasingly smaller results. And when you look at the bigger picture, you will see that Iran's strategy is not accidental. They understand that they cannot compete with the United States in military technology, but they can design a system that makes every attack strategically inefficient and economically extremely expensive. That is why nuclear facilities are buried deep in mountains, distributed across different regions, and protected by a complex network of underground infrastructure. But the story does not stop there, because even if a country can protect its most important facilities underground, it still faces a bigger question: how to force a stronger opponent to stop the war. And this is exactly where Iran developed another strategy, a strategy that does not focus on bombs or aircraft, but on the economic cost of war. Part 2. Iran's real strategy, the economic war hiding behind the missiles. If in the previous section we talked about how Iran protects its nuclear program beneath the mountains, now we have to talk about an even more important strategy: cost warfare. Because Iran understands one thing very clearly: they do not need to defeat the United States or Israel on the battlefield. They only need to make the war so expensive that the opponent no longer wants to continue. And to achieve that, they have built a military strategy closely tied to the global economy. Let us begin with a detail that seems small but is extremely important: ballistic missiles. Over many years, Iran has invested heavily in mass-producing medium-range and long-range missiles. Estimates from several defense research institutes suggest that Iran can produce about 100 missiles per month, and they have accumulated a significant stockpile. But what makes this strategy special is not the destructive power of each missile. The important factor is their cost. An Iranian ballistic missile may cost only a few $100,000 to a few $1 million to produce. Meanwhile, to intercept such a missile, Israeli or American defense systems must use high-technology interceptor missiles that cost from several million to tens of millions of dollars per unit. This creates an extremely unfavorable economic equation for the defending side. If a country has to fire 2 or 3 interceptor missiles to destroy one target, the cost can be dozens of times higher than the cost for the attacker. In military economics, this is called cost asymmetry. The attacking side spends far less money to create pressure, while the defending side must spend far more money to stop it. And when the war continues over time, this cost gap begins to accumulate into an enormous burden. Hundreds of missiles launched are not only a military attack, they are also a way to force the opponent to continuously consume resources, budget, and defense industrial capacity. But Iran's strategy does not stop at exhausting defense systems. They also target a factor that is even more sensitive: the global energy economy. The Middle East is not only a strategic military region, it is also the center of the world's oil market. About 20% of the global oil supply passes through the Strait of Hormuz, a shipping route located right next to Iran. That means any conflict in this region can directly affect energy prices across the entire world. When attacks target energy infrastructure, airports, or seaports in the Persian Gulf region, the impact is not limited to the military sphere. It spreads into global financial markets. Oil prices can rise sharply after only a few days of tension. Transportation costs increase. Airlines are forced to change flight routes. Governments begin to worry about energy inflation, and all of these factors create a chain of economic reactions that can last for months, even years. For Iran, this is the key point of the strategy. They do not need to destroy all of the opponent's infrastructure. They only need to create enough instability for global markets to react. Because when oil prices rise, when stock markets become volatile, and when energy costs begin to affect people's daily lives, political pressure on governments involved in the war also begins to increase. This is where military conflict begins to transform into economic warfare. A prolonged conflict in the Middle East does not only consume defense budgets, it can also raise energy prices, place pressure on inflation, and slow global economic growth. For major economies, especially in a context of high public debt and inflation that has not been fully controlled, a new energy shock could create very serious consequences. Therefore, from the perspective of strategic economics, the missiles that Iran launches are not only military weapons, they are tools of economic pressure. Each attack does not only target a location on the map, but also the stability of energy markets, the budget costs of the opponent, and the political patience of governments. And when you look at the entire picture, you will see that Iran's strategy is not about defeating a stronger military. Their objective is to create a war in which the cost of sustaining the conflict becomes higher over time. Meanwhile, the strategic benefits gained by the opponent become smaller and smaller. This is exactly how many weaker nations in history have dealt with superpowers, by turning war into an economic equation that even the largest economies must reconsider. But this leads us to an even bigger question. If a country can survive attacks, if it can make war extremely expensive for the opponent, then is overwhelming military power truly enough to achieve strategic objectives? Part 3. The paradox of modern warfare: winning battles does not mean winning the war. If you look purely at the military map, the United States and Israel could destroy almost every ground target in Iran. They can strike military bases, airports, radar systems, missile depots, and even target senior leadership. In many cases, these operations are carried out with nearly perfect precision. But in national strategy, military victory is only a very small part of the equation. The real question is not how many targets you can destroy, but whether those targets are the ones that actually determine the outcome of the war. History has repeatedly shown that overwhelming military power does not guarantee strategic victory. The United States won most of the major battles in the Vietnam War, but ultimately withdrew and failed to achieve its original political objectives. In the Iraq War of 2003, the United States military took only a few weeks to defeat the army of Saddam Hussein. But the consequences of that war lasted for nearly 2 decades and completely reshaped the balance of power in the Middle East. These examples illustrate an important rule: defeating an army does not mean controlling a country. Iran is an especially complex case. This is not a small nation with centralized infrastructure that can easily be destroyed. Iran has an area of more than 1.6 million square kilometers, terrain largely made up of mountains and deserts, and a population of more than 80 million people. That means even if major military facilities are attacked, the country still has enough geographic space and human resources to continue functioning. More importantly, Iran's political system does not depend on a single individual. It is an institutional structure that has existed for decades, with military, religious, and administrative organizations tightly connected to one another. Removing one leader does not make that system disappear. From an economic and political perspective, this is exactly where modern wars often reach a deadlock. Every additional day of war means military budgets continue to rise. Energy prices continue to fluctuate. And domestic political pressure grows stronger. Governments must explain to their voters why they are spending hundreds of billions of dollars on a war whose final outcome remains uncertain. Meanwhile, financial markets react very sensitively to geopolitical instability. Oil prices rise. Transportation costs increase. And energy inflation begins to spread into many other sectors of the economy. That is why when strategists talk about victory, they are not only referring to the destruction of infrastructure or the weakening of the opponent's military. True victory must be a long-term stable condition, a situation in which the opponent no longer has the ability or the motivation to continue the conflict. And that is the most difficult part of any war, because in the case of Iran, even if nuclear facilities are damaged, even if part of its military capacity is reduced, the scientific knowledge, political system, and strategic networks of the country still remain. This leads to a paradox that many analysts call the limits of military power. A superpower can destroy many things, but it cannot destroy the will of a nation, nor can it erase the knowledge and experience accumulated over many decades. And, as the war continues, the initial advantages of technology and firepower are gradually replaced by other factors: the endurance of the economy, domestic political stability, and the ability to maintain social support. Therefore, when we look at the entire picture, the most important question is not whether the United States and Israel can continue to attack Iran. The real question is whether they can achieve their strategic objectives without paying an excessively high economic and political price. Because if the cost of war continues to rise, if energy markets continue to fluctuate, and if political support begins to decline, even a superpower must reconsider its strategy. That is why many experts believe that conflicts like this rarely end with an absolute military victory. They usually end with a political agreement, a diplomatic framework, or a new balance between the sides. And the greatest paradox of this war may lie precisely there. Bombs can destroy infrastructure within a few hours. But resolving the root of the problem often takes many years of negotiation and compromise. And that is also the larger question the world is facing in an era in which military power has reached an almost absolute level. Can nations achieve their objectives through war alone? Or do all roads ultimately return to negotiation tables and economic and political decisions? If we look at history and at what is happening right now, the answer may be far clearer than what we usually hear in declarations of victory. So the final question is this: in a world where military technology can destroy almost anything, is military power still the decisive tool, or in the new era, are economics, energy, and a nation's capacity to endure the real factors that determine who truly wins? What do you think? If this conflict continues for another 5 years, which side will face greater economic pressure? Write your thoughts in the comments section. I read almost all of your opinions. And if you want to see more analyses like this about economics, geopolitics, and the events shaping the world, press like and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next video.